for segments 1 and 2. If you're interested in either one of those segments, you can contact us and ask us for a free sample class, an actual class that you can download and listen to. And here we are in the mixture of not only the modality series, cardinal, fixed, mutable, but here's the schedule for the element of Earth. And after tonight's class, we have, after tonight's class, I had myself in December already. I'm already ready for Jupiter retrograde. After tonight's class on the Earth element, we do take a little bit of a break and we come back in the beginning of December and look at the element of air and water, in addition to a Jupiter retrograde cycle. And of course, in mid-December, we are going to prep ourselves for Uranus. This class will come right after the 6th of the 7th Uranus-Pluto squares. But in January, on January 15th, Pluto's going to be exactly square the nodes, and on January 19th, Uranus will conjunct the south node. So I'm going to review those two planets and their impact, both personally and collectively, for all of us in mid-December, and prep us for their activity in January. And so here again is our opening screen for tonight's material on the Earth element. And as you can see, this is going to concern the 3 signs, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn. These beginning slides that I'm going to show next, I have all the way through the modality and element series, so I'm going to do them fairly fast. Thank you very much for letting me breeze right through them. But anytime you have questions, you can always open up that orange arrow of the webinar menu, and you can type in any questions you may have, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak live. But one of the things that we look at in evolutionary astrology is the fact that when we're looking at a sign of the zodiac, its natural house that relates to, and the planetary ruler of that sign and that house, that is an archetype that is interchangeable in consciousness. For instance, the example here, Aries, first house, and Mars are all an archetype in consciousness of initiation and bursting forth and the new beginnings that we all have coming in our life. And we go through the entire zodiac that way. We don't differentiate meaning between the sign and the house. And this is something that really helps beginning students of astrology in understanding the 12 archetypes of astrology, or the zodiac, rather than trying to have all fancy, complicated words, etc., for a sign and a house when it's the same thing. In the 12 archetypes of the zodiac, which is the circle, we divide it up, and it can be divided by 12 as the 12 archetypes, but we will find very commonly used the division of the circle by 2, the polarities, 3 modalities, 4 elements. And with evolutionary astrology, we also work with that harmonics of 8, which is the 8 phases, new, crescent, first quarter, etc. So when we're looking at this, when we have the harmonics of 1, there's no division of the circle. In astrology by aspect, this would be a conjunction, 2 planets in the same spot and with very few degrees essentially separating them. When we divide the circle in half, we have the harmonics of 2. And so in astrology, we take those 12 archetypes and we divide them up between the 2 polarities, active, passive, active, passive. Here is a slide for you where you can see in the red color or pinkish salmon color, we have all of the active polarity, Aries, Gemini, Leo, etc., which is energy moving outward when it's active polarity, also known as outward, yang, or masculine. The blue circle, we're looking at energy moving inward. We call it the passive polarity. This is Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, etc. This is inward, means energy moving back to the center, also known as yin or feminine. When we're looking at these 2 polarities and we call them masculine, feminine, we're not talking about gender specific. We're talking about energy moving outward from the center, active, or energy moving back into the center, passive. When we divide the harmonics of the circle by 3, or divide the circle by the harmonics of 3, we divide the circle into thirds. In astrology, with the 12 archetypes, we then come up with the 3 modalities: cardinal, fixed, and mutable. And here is a slide showing you the cardinal modality signs and houses, the fixed, and the mutable. If you want more information on either of those, we have done 3 classes on each of those modalities that I would refer you to. In essence, a modality is a mode of operation, an activity. Cardinal initiates, fixed sustains, and the mutable modality is adaptable. What we are working on in this series is dividing the circle by the harmonics of 4, which, as you can see here, divides it into quarters. But in astrology, we then come up with the 4 elements. And those 4 elements are fire, earth, air, and water. And when we are working with those 4 elements, they are known as a temperament. It is almost like a quality of energy that is vibrating within someone. And I'll show you in a future slide here what the 4 elements relate to, but here's what we're going to be working with tonight. We're going to be working with the element of earth, which, as you can see when we look at Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn in the zodiac, we're actually working with the trine of this element. And how this ends up coming about is the fact that 3 modalities, 4 signs each. 4 elements, 3 signs each. That mixture of 3 and 4. I have a slide for that. But here's what the 4 elements are. Your fire element is known as spiritual, earth is physical, air is mental, and water is emotional. And again, these are temperaments of energy that we all have, and many times we'll have an emphasis of one element over another. In evolutionary astrology, if we have what appears to be a lack of one element, we don't necessarily say that that doesn't exist within you. You have to look at the chart, basically interceptions. And sometimes you've had various qualities, modalities, or various elements emphasized in past lives. And there's been so much effort or energy there in past lives, it doesn't need to be emphasized this time around. If I see any examples of that in this chart, in our chart examples tonight, I'll point them out to you. When we look at the 4 elements, they are evenly divided amongst the polarities. In other words, the active polarity turns out to be the fire and air elements, energy moving outward. And the passive polarity works out to be the earth and water elements, or energy moving inward. And as you can see here, between these 12 signs, you'll see how they are divided up by the active passive polarities and the 4 different elements. Here's what I was talking about between 3 and 4, and 3 times 4 being 12. The 3 modalities contain 1 of each element. In other words, the cardinal modality has a cardinal fire, cardinal earth, cardinal air, cardinal water, etc. The 4 elements contain 1 of each modality. For instance, tonight we have cardinal earth, we have fixed earth, and we have mutable earth. And these 3 and 4 harmonics of looking at the elements and modalities, these are basics in understanding some of the archetypes that are contained within the 12 signs of the zodiac. So moving right into tonight's material with the earth element. Again, it is the element of physical, the temperament of physical, which is probably pretty easy for many of us to understand wherever we are on our astrological studies. This is the temperament of manifesting things into the physical form. So the earth element is very caught up and consumed with actually having it physical, having it manifested. So when we are looking at things that are manifested into the physical world, they become our foundations. They become what's real. Look at how you manifest into this physical body. And you pinch yourself hard enough, it hurts. You're in that physical form. We're all in physical form, regardless of what element we may have emphasized or not have enough of. We learn through this physical environment when we're here on Earth. When we are in this physical form, we're looking to always be able to ground ourselves, to have the stability of this physical body we're in, this physical earth that we're represented by or live upon, all of the physical things that make up, for instance, food, clothing, shelter. We want it real. We want the manifestation of it. On its broadest level possible, the earth element is going to represent what we call Gaia, or our earth mother. And all you got to do is just look around you. Gaia, or planet Earth, is the source of all the physical resources that we can manifest. Everything that you have around you, from your clothing to your computer to the water bottle to your cell phone to whatever is sitting next to you, maybe a pet, everything comes from the resources of Earth when the element of spirit or energy manifests into the element of Earth or the physical. So these three signs, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, are always concerned with resources, the manifestation of physical resources. And these physical resources are seen as security. All three earth elements are passive polarity, and that's energy moving back to center, or energy that wants to be grounded. So resources is seen as security for all three of these elements. Now, something that we don't necessarily always associate beyond the element of Taurus, we don't always see this in Virgo or Capricorn, but because they're of the earth element, any of the three earth elements are concerned with being earthy or sensual and sexual. I'll talk about that in more detail as we get to each of these three elements, but remember that this is there. And we don't see it necessarily in Virgo or Capricorn due to what we know as a lot of the patriarchal distortions on planet Earth. But all three archetypes of the element Earth are grounded in their physical bodies. And the physical body is a body of the senses. So looking at this element of Earth, again, to me, this is pretty simple when we're looking at the four elements. They're pretty self-explanatory. So I don't have, a plethora of words because we all get it. This is pretty simple to understand. If there's at any time throughout this webinar anything that I'm not bringing up that you're curious about, by all means type a question into Leroy, and I'm very happy to speak about it and talk about it through the lens of the four elements for you. So any questions, comments from anybody? You kind of get this earth element. It's physical, it's manifestation, it's resources of every type. So I'm going to move along here into the Taurus archetype, including the second house here and its ruler Venus. They're all going to be vibratory to this element of Earth. This is the Taurus side of Venus. It's sometimes called the inner side of Venus, and this is because of the passive polarity. When we look at Taurus and we combine it with the polarities of passive, we also combined it with the fixed modality as well as the element of Earth. So Taurus, being the first of the three Earth elements, is very, very concerned with survival, literal, physical survival. When it's at its most basic, it is food, clothing, and shelter. Once we have most of our basic physical resources provided for, then we'll move into some of the finer resources of Taurus, which could be excess food, or a love of art, or wanting to have the luxury items when it comes to food, clothing, or shelter. It just gets finer along the scale and more excess along the scale. But one of the things we'll notice with the element of Earth through Taurus in working with resources is learning to see ourself as a resource. Again, learning to see our own human self as a resource. And therefore, if you see somebody who has very strong element of Taurus in their chart, or a lot of aspects to Venus, or a lot of planets in the second house, then many times there's going to be a very, very strong life force, or you need to observe, correlate this. Sometimes there's a lack of resource. For instance, I have a mother who is a second house Pluto, Taurus soul, as we call it. And she's barely into the Pluto and Leo generation, 0 degrees Pluto Leo, but she's a second house Pluto. And I'm amazed at the power and strength of my mother. Now, she was the 11th of 12 children, and so Grandma didn't have a whole lot of resources to give her, and my dad's wedding present to my mother was false teeth. But other than that, she is just about as strong as they come. And it's not that she can, bench press 300 pounds. It's just that you feel the energy of a strong survival instinct coming through her. Now, I also, for example of this, there's another client that just popped into my head. I haven't seen this client for many years, and she was a second house Pluto, and she had Pluto in Libra. And she was the opposite. There was almost no life force, and perhaps the Pluto Libra blended in with the codependency in relationships, but this was a woman who had many, many serious health issues as well as addiction issues. And it was like if the wind blew, it would blow her over. So again, when you see the Taurus element of Earth, you can look for that strong life force, and many times it will be there, or they've come in to create that strong life force. And so when we're working with Taurus in that fixed modality in the element of Earth, one of the most basics of Taurus is a simplification of resources. They will have the basics of what they desire, and many times will be comfortable with that and don't necessarily need to go beyond that. However, you can also find that if there was You know, if there has been, for instance, the example that I'm going to use for you in the chart here is someone who had no resources growing up, an alcoholic father, a mother who married, divorced, and married, divorced 8 times, and this chart example ended up in an orphanage for a brief period of time. And so that need to survive went over the top. I'll show you when we get to this chart. So you can see sometimes one of those extremes with this earth element through Taurus. But in essence, what we find with Taurus is the ability to create resources, the talents we have in creating resources. Jeffrey Wolf Green would say you would look at the sign on the second house cusp, you look for any planets in the second house, you look for Venus, and you would be able to see what any soul's natural talents were in regard to going out into the world and creating the resources, including money, of what they needed to survive and provide for themselves and for a family if necessary. So Taurus creates the resources, and it also then learns how to conserve the resources. And distorted Taurus, fearful of not having enough resources, there'll be hoarding, possessiveness, and if they then start having the evolution from consensus, individuated, and spirituating, they can recognize on the ultimate spiritual level that source energy, God is the ultimate resource, and they can be a little more flowing with their resources because they realize that it's not even though we live on a finite earth, the ability to be creative with the resources that we have here is endless. And I think we'll really see that put to the test as we continue on with climate change on a broader level. And so, because of the passive polarity as well with Taurus, then, we're looking at inner versus outer resources. Taurus is that fixed modality. And so we're looking at what is important to us, what do we value. And then once we have those values, we find the needs, the desires to go out and create those resources. And again, because it's fixed modality, we get to a certain point, and for most of us, we're okay with a certain amount of resources. And as we're evolving the earth archetypes, this is going to go beyond Taurus. As we're evolving all 3 earth elements, we're going to go from there is a saturation point of outer resources, and then the inner resources start to become more and more and more valuable. We initiate that process here with the first element, Earth Taurus. And what are my inner values? And then that shows me what I have as an outer value. What I want is outer resources. Now, Taurus is one of the signs of the zodiac. Taurus in its polarity, Scorpio, is the 2 archetypes that always get spoken about a lot in regards to sensuality and sexuality. Taurus is known as being self-sensual, self-sexual, i.e. masturbation. Scorpio is known as merging with another on a sensual, sexual osmosis level, or the physically having sex with another. I'll speak more to the emotional part of that with Scorpio when we look at the water element. So for many of us, it's pretty easy to understand, pretty self-explanatory, how Taurus can be very sensual. In health and wellness astrology, Taurus rules the 5 senses, sight, sound, hearing, whatever. You know what the 5 senses are. And as a matter of fact, it is this archetype, Taurus Venus, in the second house, and to a lesser extent included, because Venus has dual rulership of Libra as well, you can include the Libra archetype in here. But because Taurus has rulership of all these senses, it rules the pheromones. And in natural law, we used to choose our partners through the sense of smell. And this is something that I actually counsel astrology clients with when I see a lot of Taurus second, Libra seventh, or a lot of Venus. You want to be able to smell the partner. And the rule of thumb goes like this. If you really get their natural scent, a real strong whiff of their natural odor, if you are repelled, it means past life karma is not so great. Heal it up as best as you can, move on. If their natural scent is attracting to you, the past life karma has more or less been of a more positive nature, move forward. And if the scent is neutral, you have free choice. So yes, Taurus, part of its resources included in that survival is the procreation, being able to merge with another and actually bring forth a new being, regardless of the species. So just in case I didn't touch upon any of or the rest of these distortions, the fixed modality is what blends with the element of earth with Taurus and gives them that reputation for being stubborn or bullheaded or stuck in a rut or very slow to change. And it's not that that fixed modality is not capable of changing. It's just that the element of earth, because it's so grounded in security, it wants to know where the next security is before it makes the change. If it gets too distorted, too stuck, too stubborn, then the polarity Scorpio will come along and bring about the plutonium, Pluto rules Scorpio, the plutonium upset that Jeffrey Green would call it. Taurus is like a frog in the bottom of the well, the frog in the well syndrome, he'd call it. And as long as the frog's in the bottom of the well and it's looking at its little circle of the sky up there, its little pie of the sky, it feels very nice and safe. But you throw the frog out of the well and he's got the whole horizon in front of him and insecurity hits. That's the energy of Taurus with the fixed modality and the earth element. And yet Taurus does evolve just like every other archetype as well. And the more that that fixed earth element can recognize the changes in front of it and make movement in those directions, the less it has to have the intensity of the cataclysms. And so, again, any questions on this archetype, anything that you've not touched upon, you're always welcome to raise your hand, ask questions. I'd like to now show you an example. And in keeping with both the modality and element series, I'm choosing famous entertainers that we all know. I've known for a long time that Cher is a second house Pluto, just like my mother. I've liked her music over the years, and I can remember being a young teenager and liking her and Sunny. Well, here we're looking at not only Pluto in the second house, the Taurus house, we're looking at Mars there too. This right off the bat would start to tell me, if they're not initiating a strong life force here, they're coming in with one. And that sure seems to be the case with her as I share some of her life history with you. But we also have up here, here's that interception that I told you about. We have Sun in Taurus and we have Mercury in Taurus. And Venus is pretty active. Venus, that ruler of inner Taurus, is in a big conjunction with the North Node here. Let me see if what else I'm looking at. There's probably a few other aspects that are going on as well. Looks like a wide trine to Jupiter in conjunct to the moon. But what I had wanted to say when we're looking at the four elements, and this is not only true with the elements, this is also true with the modalities, and you won't always, well, I look at it with the modalities when I'm looking at this. Even though you never see a modality, well, you can see the sign as a modality intercepted, okay? I'm mixing up my houses and signs here. When we're looking at signs of the zodiac, let me speak clearly, and we see a sign intercepted, for instance, Taurus and Scorpio. Traditional astrology has a tendency to say that that energy cannot get out, it cannot be released, and it needs to be worked upon, developed, and it needs to be emphasized in this life. And evolutionary astrology says, no, not an absolute. That may be true, but it's also possible that this sign has been so emphasized in past lives, it doesn't need to be emphasized this time around. It's already been developed. It's already there. Again, you learn this through observation and correlation, but one of the ways you can look at it is, for instance, Taurus, which is ruled by Venus. So see if there's planets in Taurus. We have 2. See if Venus is having any emphasis. It's pretty emphasized in EA when it's in the midst of a conjunction with Uranus and the North Node. And are there planets in the Taurus ruled house, which is the second ruled house? Yes, there is. So it would lead us to be looking for an observation that perhaps this Taurus survival instinct is pretty emphasized. I would say then that the earth element is emphasized, and I would say that the fixed modality is emphasized. So you'd be looking at the element and the modality. You could even bring in the polarity, Taurus passive polarity. All of that might be emphasized. You would do the same thing with Scorpio. Are there planets in the 5th house? No. Ruler, Pluto, is over here in the 2nd. It's got a conjunction to Mars. And if you look at this, it's in a square to Mercury. That's also in Taurus. It's possible that it could have some emphasis here. Are there any planets in the Scorpio 8th house? No, there's not. The ruler of that, Uranus, is in here with this Venus stellium. You start adding it all together and you can start observing that there are several clues that it's quite possible this Taurus-Scorpio interception has been emphasized in past lives, and it's already there. It's not a missing energy. And for those of you who know some of Cher's history, all right, she is known to have been in the film industry and the music industry for decades upon decades. She is well known for her plastic surgery. If you look at Cher, and as I did my research on this chart, she has started yet again another tour with another album. And so she is still continuing to be active in the entertainment industry. Now, having been known to have had lots of surgery, oh, that was my point. You look at her, and here she is now, approaching what, 70 years old? You see any photo of her? She does not look like she is in her 60s. So one of the things that you can find with Taurus, and in this case, that's 2nd house Pluto and Sun Mercury in Taurus, is it goes beyond that food, clothing, and shelter with the basic resources, and it goes over the top with needing mega resources. Now, she's the one I was talking about with the fact that father was an alcoholic, mother tried to make it in the film industry, and married and divorced 8 times. And Cher did for a few years have a somewhat stable stepfather, but mom divorced him as well. And she moved around a lot as a child with mother and all of these different marriages, and ended up in an orphanage for a little while. And is known to saying that she didn't like the Catholic nuns because they didn't want her to go back to her mother as a bad influence. And so you can see that what I'm picking up on this with this chart, and what I know about Cher, is very, very strong survival instinct. And yet, relative to perhaps consensus state of the soul, she doesn't feel secure, and she part of what I've read as well is when she divorced Sonny for cheating on her. When she was younger, she was not anywhere near of what she was like. Her and Sonny were very, when they first started out, they were very conservative in their dress. They were both anti-drugs. They were very monogamous, and they came to popularity in the 60s when the sex, drugs, rock and roll was all going on, and they were kind of antithetical to all that. And so Cher was fairly conservative with all of that. And then she found out that Sonny was cheating on her. And so she finally, broke away from him and divorced him. And some of you might know this. What did she do? She ended up with Greg Allman with the Allman Brothers Band, and married him, and he was a heroin addict and went to the opposite extremes. She actually had a son with him. Her and Sonny had Chastity, a little girl who did a sex operation. Chaz Bono is now male. And then she had Elijah Blue with Greg Allman. Over the years then, as she broke away from Sonny, who was very controlling of her career, her appearance, how she sang, everything like that, she discovered her sexuality. And that's pretty much what we know her for, that Taurian sensualness, that over the top with the outfits, over the top with, remaining thin. She was very tall. She had the beauty of her Cherokee ancestry. And so she has kept going with it. Part of her public persona in the media, they would call her a poster child for plastic surgery. So again, to me, it's a very strong emphasis of this Taurus energy. It's also an emphasis of the insecurity that is underneath that. At one point when she was single, I can't remember if this was in between Sonny and Greg Allman, or it might have been after the divorce to Greg Allman, she ended up in debt, and that's when she took on, I think if I remember it right, becoming a fitness addict. Cher put out fitness videos back in the 80s or 90s or something like that. She did several of those. She did infomercials on fitness and became known for that. And she said it was how she could survive until she could get either her music or her film career to take off. She won either a best actress or best supporting actress. She won an Academy Award for the movie Mask. And so while she has been a perfectionist in that physical body, all that Taurus energy, one of her breakout films was Mask. And I remember that years ago when it came out. And she played a single mother who had a handicapped son, and he had facial disfigurations. And she has supported handicapped children on a philanthropy level ever since then. She still does to this day. She also is very strong in supporting the LGBT movement. When her daughter Chastity first came out as gay, um, she was very upset about it. It shocked her. And here's one area. This might be the Gemini with Venus and that North Node Uranus conjunction up here that is showing up right here. When Chastity came out, Cher said, I got over being upset and I decided that I needed to check into it and look at it. And so she opened her eyes to the LBG community and then became an advocate for it. And she's very well loved and respected in the LBG community for embracing chastity as she did a sex change and became Chaz male, and still continues to support that LBGD community. Now, in the world of evolutionary astrology, of course, sexuality is Taurus, second house, Scorpio, eighth house. You can see, again, the intercepted signs. So that comes in there. You can see it that way. Sometimes you'll see it in the cardinal signs because in EA, we'll look at Cancer, fourth house, Capricorn, 10th house, as sometimes being gender changes, how you can see gender change from past life to current life, in addition to just the observation by physical characteristics. So you can look at sometimes the cardinal modality and the fixed modality as showing that. And I suspect personally that as we are seeing so much sexual suppression from the Garden of Eden myth separating spirit and flesh, as we are seeing so much just sexual suppression over the last 2,000 years, if not the last 5,000 years, I think we're going to see with the coming Aquarian age a lot of sexual orientation thrown up in the air. And I think you're going to be able to see it in all 12 archetypes of the zodiac, quite frankly. Just my personal opinion. We'll see how that works out as observing and correlating it in actual history, or actual future, I should say that. Cher is also well known in almost like the fashion industry because, again, when she really discovered her sexuality as an artist, she went over the top with outfits. She was wearing the skimpy see-through stuff that seems so common today. Cher was wearing that stuff back in the late 70s, early 80s, before anybody else was doing it. That could be some of this Taurus energy, the Mars, the instinctual sexual desire. A second house Pluto tends to many times have a strong sexual drive. The combination of that, she could, be someone who's very comfortable with her sexuality. She's known for having dated a lot of younger men, including still dating younger men. And when you put Taurus in the 11th house, what you do to the earth element then is you add that Aquarian or 11th house detachment and sometimes voyeurism. There can be an intensity. This is fixed air. All right. This is the fixed modality and the element of air when we're looking at the 11th house that we're blending in with this Taurus energy. And so sometimes there needs to be over the top, more and more intensity voyeurism with Aquarius in order to get into its body. It's possible that some of that could be there for her in regards to the sensuality that's naturally there that was, again, actually suppressed by her first husband. Who knows what happened in, the orphanage imprinting and watching mom and mom's. I think both her parents were promiscuous, and that's why there was so much marriage and divorce with mom that went on for her. But she would be an observer of all that, and she decided to take that earth element of being really physical and just go for it. And with the Venus here, as I'm seeing, combine this Venus ruler with Uranus and then these planets in Taurus, not afraid to shock people, not afraid to speak out about it. And so that's giving you information on share. Do I have comments or questions? Anything in the chart you didn't see? Anything else that anybody knows about her that you want to share? She's known to have a very, very extravagant lifestyle. Where was the detail? Did I hear Leroy here? Go ahead, honey, if that's you.
The board's pretty quiet, but it's pretty obvious over the years if you've watched her development since Sunny and Cher. She's a woman of fortitude, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, most definitely. She was one of those, it's become popular for a lot of entertainers to go do their, what's the term for it, when they show up in Las Vegas and do so many shows. Oh, here it is. In 2008, she started a 3-year, 200 performance residency at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, and $60 million per year.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's that Taurian energy. I mean, all three of my examples with the element of earth in the entertainment industry are going to have resources in the picture. But again, she didn't come from that type of a background, and I suspect, reading between the lines with mother's, lifestyle. And she also had a half sister, and both half sisters were just tossed around all over the place as mom was going here and there. And then they did have a little bit of a stable environment along their I think junior high years when mom was married, and that the marriage didn't last, but they had a few years where mom had some money, and they actually ended up at a private school in the LA area, and Cher remembers feeling so out of touch because that wasn't her background up to that point. So she didn't, start out with the silver spoon in the mouth, but that Taurian energy sure was able to create it. And I guess in fairness to her, she's been very, very supportive of in the philanthropy world, and doesn't advertise it really. So if no questions, we'll move ourselves on to our next element. As we move on into Virgo, here we're starting to take that passive polarity and blend it with the mutable modality and Earth. And so what we come up with Virgo, 6th house, and Mercury, like Venus, rules 2 signs. And Mercury is known as the inner side of Mercury. Virgo is known as the inner side of Mercury because of the passive polarity, energy moving inward, inner side of Mercury. But here with this archetype now, we start to get into all of the details of the resources. Here's Mercury blending in with Virgo. And so it's all of the detail and daily management of our resources. And whereas Taurus in the element of Earth was seeing ourself as a resource, with Virgo, we're learning to see work as a resource and a value. So it's what can we do that is a resource to us. So you can see all of that mercurial busybody detail and everything that starts to come along with this archetype of Virgo that those of us who have Pluto and Virgo are very, very familiar with. Speaking of myself as an example, Virgo is do, do, do. There's that element of earth, being physically active. Virgo gets involved with that. But work becomes something that we value. Work becomes the resource. Now, what can happen here is that there is physical overwhelm when we're not in touch with the process of life. We're dealing with the mutable modality here with the earth element. So we've got to recognize that there is a process to life. There's a continuation to life. There's an adaptation to life, that mutable modality coming in. And so Virgo, how many times have you heard Virgo, well, if I just get this project done, then I can rest. If I just get the house cleaned, then I can rest. If I just get this other job, then everything's going to be okay for me. That's the earth element in Virgo, wanting that security and always, putting that security out there, like the cart in front of the horse, dangling the carrot in front of the whatever. That's the mixture of that mutable modality and earth element, where Virgo can't get in touch with that adaptability. And so it goes into overwhelm. And when it goes into overwhelm, it goes into one of those distortions, which is crises. Crises over all the work to do. Or element of earth, crises over resources. If Virgo in the element of earth is not building upon, again, we have the triune. Remember the element of the trine that comes through with all of the elements. And so if we've not built upon Taurus and self as a resource, then when we get to the earth element of Virgo, we cannot see ourself as a resource. We cannot see resource values in our world. We come up with all kinds of resource crises. And Virgo can have resources thrown in its lap, and it'll give them away. It'll throw them away. It'll have an expense come along. How many times does, an emphasis on Virgo's sixth house, or sometimes aspects to Mercury? Okay, I finally got the car paid off. I don't have to have a car payment anymore. And they loan their vehicle to a friend and they total the car. Now, they either have a choice to go out and buy, chances are trading in a lesser vehicle, or there's the payment again. So Virgo can run into crises over physical resources of all kinds if it's not building upon itself as a resource and its value in the work environment and in what it has to give to others. And so when we're working with this element of Virgo and we're dealing with all of the mercurial details in managing the resources of our world, the earth element, Virgo will go for being the perfectionist. Got to get it done just right. Got to have it just perfect. The house has got to be cleaned. We've got to get rid of the dust. Can't have anybody over until I've got the house clean. Or it'll go for the extreme, which is the Pisces polarity, and it'll be outright neglectful of its resources. If Virgo isn't having value with itself as a resource, again, coming off of Taurus, then it's just going to be overwhelmed in the world of resources. And you can sometimes see people who have, for instance, we have a young adult in our life and South Node in the sixth house. and he can live like an absolute pig, and he just doesn't, he gets overwhelmed by the details of the resources in his world and having to manage the details of resources in his world. And it wasn't something that was taught in his early environment, and so his dad and I are working with it. And Leroy, you will be very happy to know that you can walk through our son's room tonight. I
Yahoo!
work through it. I have Pluto in Virgo, and I have a son with a south node in the sixth, and we are opposites in that area. And I realize that sometimes I just have to not be such, a perfectionist. I have my own Virgo lessons that I'm learning on a soul level. But I also recognize that when I'm working with my son who has this south node in the sixth, it's just being able to be patient and go through the details. So as I was waiting for class to start up, my son comes and says, "Okay, time for inspection." That's the joke. And it wasn't too bad. And so we went in there, and of course, there were still coins laying on the floor. There were socks under the bed. There was, a few other little details. And I just go and I just patiently, this is Virgo, just patiently, this is the mutable modality working in with the Virgo earth element, patiently working through a detail, just patiently working through the process of the details. And for instance, he had 3 pillows on the bed. I says, "How many pillows do you need?" He says, "Well, I'm just using the one." And I says, "Do you think you could take these other 2 pillows and put them away from me?" "I can do that." "Well, you got 2 comforters on the bed. Do you need both of them?" "No, I'm just using the one. The other one's dirty." And I says, "Well, how about if we fold it up and we put it in the hallway and take care of it?" And bless my son's friend, he was over and he says, "Our washing machine's big enough. Forrest can bring it over to my house and we'll wash it tonight." And I'm going, there you go. So it's that Virgo being able to just go through the process of the details. And there's always going to be another detail to process through with Virgo. That's, again, the earth element with Virgo is all the details. Now, I had said earlier that all 3 of the earth elements work through the physical, and therefore all 3 work with sensual and sexuality. What do we know about Virgo? Well, its popularity in traditional resource is to freeze up, to be frigid. And this is coming off of the distortions with Virgo Pisces. This is coming off of the distortions of religion, that women aren't allowed to be sensual. Women, sexuality only exists to procreate, and anything else is a sin. But yet when you get to natural Virgo, that ability to be in touch with the details, with the processing of the physical. Virgo can be very, very, very sensual in its ability to touch, in its ability to give to another, whether they are making them a bowl of homemade soup and they're getting the spices just right, or whether they are learning how to give another person a massage. Look at how Virgo in the 6th house is known as health and wellness, or the healing, and how many with an emphasis of Virgo 6th house or Mercury turn out to be massage therapists. Right there in front of you in natural law, there's that element of earth that knows how to touch another, that sees another person's body as a resource, and just by touch can know where to soothe, where to push, where to help the energy free up and move again. distortions of this archetype with Earth can overgive resources. It can overgive itself as a resource when it doesn't value self. In other words, it can be very good at pleasuring the other person sensually, sexually, but doesn't ask for that in kind to receive back. I think I've kind of touched upon some of the distortions as I was working through all of this. Questions or comments with the earth element through the archetype of Virgo? Is this coming through pretty self-explanatory for everybody?
Kim, there is a question on the board, and I'm going to go ahead and attempt to unmute Patsy. And if Patsy, if you're listening, I'm just going to test to see if you're mic'd up, okay? Patsy, do you feel comfortable in asking your question of Kim?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you can hear me.
We
Sure.
hear you loud and clear. Hello,
Oh,
Patsy.
okay. Hi. Thank you, Kimmery. Well, I was just wondering, I think I stated it, I said to clarify where the perfectionist response in Virgo comes from, Kimmery. Is it kind of like from a distortion standpoint? Can it be a reaction of coping to over-managing the resources? Because I'm kind of comparing that to Pisces, which would be kind of more going with the flow. So I get the neglectful of resources that comes from the Pisces kind of crisis, but I'm not sure the origin behind the perfectionist. Is that a coping behavior because they're not managing their resources that well?
There's multiple answers, but you're touching on a couple of things. When we're following the 12 archetypes around the zodiac in evolutionary astrology, you might be familiar with Leo. Jeffrey Green would describe Leo as, think of a pyramid and Leo's on top of the pyramid. It's at the center of its universe. And when you go from Leo to Virgo, Virgo's a transitional archetype between the first half of the zodiac self and the second half of the zodiac others, which is initiated with Libra. And so Virgo turns the pyramid upside down, and Virgo's on the bottom of the pyramid. And so Virgo is the archetype where we learn to recognize we're not the center of the world. Virgo then also becomes the archetype where we recognize where we have to change in order to be able to interact with others. Virgo between Leo and Libra. So this is how Virgo becomes aware of the fact that it is not perfect. It becomes aware of its lack of perfection. So if Virgo doesn't have a resource within itself and its value in what it does in the world, it can overcompensate for that by trying to be a perfectionist. Now, having said that, that can be a distortion. But a natural expression of perfectionism in Virgo is the fact that Virgo recognizes that it is here to self-improve. And one of the ways that I will express this is, for instance, when we know Virgo earth element, diet, exercise, and rest. How many of us in today's Western world would, for many of us, we can be overweight and we want to go on a diet. And so that's a natural self-improvement that we want to perfect. We want to learn how to eat better, drink better, exercise better. And so there's a natural way in which we're on the path to perfection. And Virgo has to recognize via the Pisces polarity, which is the potential for perfection, that many times it doesn't exist here on planet Earth. That's why we're here. We're on the path of perfecting. And both Virgo and Pisces polarity have to make peace with the process of perfecting, or perhaps a nicer way to say it would be the process of self-improvement. The process of managing resources a little better, a little better, a little better, a little better. Whether we're talking about a diet plan, cleaning our bedroom, or our work environment that we do 8 to 5. Does that make sense, Patsy? I think Leroy might have muted you again.
Yes, thanks, Kim Marie. It does. I really appreciate the clarification on the natural evolutionary process of
Yes.
that, and just how with the pyramid, I'd heard that before. But yeah, the fragmented part I see is out there, but also the natural evolution. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Anybody else with Virgo? This Virgo through the element of Earth. Well, here's our example for this one. This is Jay Leno, who is the former host of The Tonight Show. And if any of you happen to watch any evening TV, you might know that The Tonight Show, it started, God, there was somebody before Johnny Carson. I don't remember who that one was. But, you know, Jay Leno started out
Jack
as
Parr.
a
Jack Parr.
Jack Parr, Johnny Carson, Jay Leno, and now Jimmy Fallon. Those have been the four. I remember being a little girl and growing up with Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show with my folks on TV, because if you're like me, born in the 50s, there were 3 TV channels and you watched what your folks wanted to watch. So I grew up with Bonanza, Ponderosa, Johnny Carson. There's probably 1 or 2 others. But I can remember tidbits of him. But you know, Jay Leno's had a couple of controversies in his life, which is that Virgo, you know, bringing up that crises in order to self-improve, perfect. And the first one, I didn't know this tidbit, but Jay Leno started out as a comedian. And he had a pretty relatively, let's say, normal childhood. Who of us has a quote unquote normal childhood? He didn't, you know, he wasn't exposed like Cher was to moving all over the place, never knowing who who's going to show up in your mother's bed, and never knowing where your next meal's going to come from. That was Cher's background. Jay Leno had a pretty stable environment with his parents. His father was a homemaker, his mother was a homemaker, and his father was an insurance salesman. And he grew up in the Northeast, and he actually obtained a bachelor's degree in speech therapy. And I should point out before we get started here, I'm sorry about this, I moved right in. Here is a 6th house Pluto. All right. And as you can see, we have 3 planets in Virgo. We have Saturn, Moon, and Mars. And when we look at the planet Mercury, I'm not seeing any, well, it's got a trine to Mars and trine to the 12th house. Otherwise, I'm not seeing real active. Oh, Mercury square the horizontal. Mercury square the ascendant, descendant, self and others, and communications with self and others. So we do have some activity by the sign, the house, and the ruler Mercury. But he obtained a bachelor's degree in speech therapy, and then he started a comedy club in college, and that's where he got interested in being a comedian, which then led to, he never was very successful in the film world as an actor, although he did have small parts, but he ended up getting a comedian spot on the Johnny Carson show. And so that's how he started, and he became a substitute host for Johnny Carson. His first little Virgo controversy was when he was chosen to replace Johnny Carson as the host of The Tonight Show. Everybody expected that to go to David Letterman. And you may know that we have Late Night with David Letterman. David Letterman's been doing that since 1982, and he's just now going to retire next year. But there was kind of some turbulence around it, and people were going back and forth over it way back then because they felt that Jay Leno was an upstart, and David Letterman had earned it, and Jay Leno hadn't. Virgo, self-worth. All right. Jay Leno, it might be a little bit of that Taurian stubbornness, Taurus in the second house that was coming through in him going after being able to be that host. The more later controversy that most of us know is when Jay Leno a few years ago, I can't remember what the years were, but the exact years, but Jay Leno said he was going to retire from The Tonight Show, and Conan O'Brien was going to become his successor. And Jay Leno retired from The Tonight Show at the height of his success, and instead of riding off into the sunset, the workaholic, he wanted to come back and do another evening show, and they kind of switched it around, gave him an earlier time slot. He wasn't going to host a lot of guests like he did, and both him and Conan O'Brien went down in the ratings. And you may remember the news a few years ago, out of the blue, NBC pays Conan O'Brien off and brings Jay Leno back. And there was another controversy around it, this one bigger, because people thought that Jay Leno should have rode off into the sunset and honored his word. And the major studios, NBC, money is king, they're like, we're going to change whatever we need to change to get ourselves back on top of the late night ratings again. So those are the little controversies with Jay Leno. He's just now recently retired again for the last time, and this time they handled it with kid gloves, let's say, when Jay left and they brought Jimmy Fallon in, and who's doing great as his successor. And Jay Leno has moved on to do other things, but he's nowhere in the late night show. Now, one of the things that I thought was so interesting about Jay Leno, I couldn't decide whether to put him into the Taurus element of Earth or the Virgo element of Earth, and I went with Cher and I put Jay Leno into Virgo, but he's known as being a perfectionist and just being a fusspot in regards to the details around his life. And he's known as saying that he does not spend a penny of the money that he earned during his years at The Tonight Show. He lives off his money from his stand-up comedy routines. Lord knows how much resources this person has put away. But at latest count, he has 286 vehicles. That's going to be his new show with whatever he's, developing. He's going to have some type of a garage show because he is known as being a collector of vehicles. Now, there is that Virgo perfectionism where when we get enough resources and we just go overboard with the resources and overboard with the management of the resources. 169 automobiles and 117 motorcycles. He's just a collector of all of those. And I thought that is so over the top with resources, and that Virgo desire to have another and another and another and another. Sometimes with the element of Virgo, you can see eating disorders with all three elements of the earth sign. Taurus, you would see it as the overindulgence. Virgo, you can see it with an excess of resources, but when it comes to the physical diet with Virgo, that's where you see the exerciseaholics. You know, this is the woman or the man at the gym. They got to go to the gym 7 days a week, and they're as buff as they look, and their body is as toned as they can be, but it's still not perfect enough for them. There's that distortion we were talking about earlier with Virgo. And you know, how many people need 300 vehicles? That's an excess of earth and consensus earth. When you start to see the evolution of the earth element through Virgo, that's when you start to see the healers of the zodiac, the Florence Nightingales, or you see somebody who really wants to be of service to others. You see somebody who takes their wealth and uses it to be, you know, supportive of health and wellness, for instance, with Virgo, or supportive of um, just improving something in society. They could be supportive of, you know, the whole medical field or the alternative fields in some way. I did not come across anything on Jay Leno in regards to philanthropy. And I thought, wow, doesn't live, he puts everything away that he earned from the Tonight Show and lives off of his stand-up comedy routines. Now there's Virgo being practical, even though it's mega practical in regards to economies of scale. But all his resources go to the collection of these vehicles. Now, he has been married for a long time. One wife, they've been married for decades and decades, and they agreed very early on when they got married that neither one of them wanted children, so they don't have any children. It would be nice to see if we could you know, hear of Jay Leno being a philanthropist at some point. Who knows? Maybe he will create car museums when he leaves. Looking at the Virgo here in the seventh house, here's the stand-up comedian. Here is the person who could be self-deprecating and sometimes make fun of himself. When he went through the second controversy with Conan O'Brien and him coming back to the Tonight Show, Jay Leno made an effort to say, this was NBC, this wasn't me. And I think that's pretty much what it was, that he wasn't trying to kick Conan O'Brien out. It was NBC that was doing that. But this is the part where, you know, we've got all the Virgo in the seventh house. This is where we can understand others. This is where some of all the words start to come through. The Mercury square the horizontal axis, ascendant, descendant. This is where some of the controversy comes in, where he's not being heard, or he gets stubborn sometimes with words. Again, I saw the Sun Taurus Earth element in Taurus second as the, in some ways, going after the resources in early on when he was chosen over David Letterman for the Tonight Show. But this is the easy comedian here, okay? And this is the controversy with communications and the public reception of that, and the public being somewhat critical of him. From what I've been able to gather, he is has a very happy marriage with his life. Pluto in the sixth, the Virgo in the seventh. They're very happy together. They're very supportive of each other. like to be with each other, all of that type of stuff with there. So we've got a little bit of a mixture here. I'm sure we're still working with that consensus world. But we've got a little mixture of the Virgo controversies and crises, as well as the Virgo perfectionism just going overboard with physical resources in this collection of cars. So anything that you have questions or comments upon that I haven't touched upon for you? All right, you're a little quiet. I'm going to take a drink and we'll move on to our last archetype. So now we're going to go into the element of Earth through the archetype of Capricorn. And here we're going to be blending again the passive polarity with the cardinal modality. So we have passive cardinal Earth here. So we're going to be looking at the archetype of Capricorn, 10th house, and its ruler Saturn. And so this is the third of the earth elements, and so here we start to work with the accumulation of all our resources. Now remember, I said Taurus was seeing ourself as a resource. Virgo was seeing work as a resource, and oh, by the way, I forgot this part. Jay Leno's a workaholic. He was well known as a workaholic. And so with Capricorn, we see power as a resource. And here, as we work with that accumulation of resources, we want to have power over the manifestation of the resource. And so we're many well known, that Capricorn being that 10th house archetype, being that archetype of career. Well, this is how we are building upon where we get that word career. It's the accumulation of resources, and it's the sense of power itself as a resource. Being the boss, being the CEO, being the manager, being the one to be in charge. That's the cardinal modality coming through on a physical earth level. And so here we start working with resources on a larger level. We're working with, we can find social groups, political groups, institutions. Just think of, collective groups of people on all levels, and how that then leads to controlling resources. A university will control the resources of educating its students. A political body will control the resources of its agenda. We can look at any type of social group. You can look at the capitalistic world and, a company that is a department store, and it's controlling the resources of all the goods that it sells. This is where the element, the earth element of Capricorn gets involved. It's not self anymore. And it's not the day-to-day busybodiness. This is where we go for the whole enchilada. This is where we want to have all the resources, and we want to have control of all those resources, especially when we're working with it in the consensus level. Now, in evolutionary astrology, what we look at underneath the surface with all that is the phrases self-responsibility and self-determination. So when we're looking at the earth element through Capricorn, and we're looking at self-responsibility, we're looking at that maturation process that I've got to take myself in the physical world and be in charge of myself. I've got to take charge in the physical world of what I'm going to do when I grow up. Self-determination. Career is not just necessarily the accumulation of resources or the accumulation of a social position. It is being the determining factor of what you're going to do in the world. What you're going to do in your physical world, in the manifestation of everything, in your maturation process as you mature as a human being and become an adult in this physical world. So there is, again, there's an element of being able to know that you can take charge of yourself in the physical world. And that's really what's underneath it on deeper levels, especially when you're looking at the individualization and spiritualization of the archetype of Capricorn through the earth element. And when you're looking at learning how to be successful in that physical world, all three evolutionary states from the perspective of EA, consensus, individuated, and spirituated, all three have the ability to then bring that forward and show others how to be resourceful in the world, show others how to determine their own life and be successful in their physical environments. We don't always have to see Capricorn, and especially, right now with Pluto, the soul, individually, collectively, transiting through the archetype of Capricorn. We don't always have to have the no, I put end justifies the means. It's means justifies the end, isn't it? Right? Somebody help me with that one, Leroy.
The ends always
I just
justify
noticed
the
that.
means.
Do I have it right? Okay. But in other words, we don't always have to have the distortions of Capricorn going on. Successful Capricorn in the element of earth can be so helpful in helping others. There was, back in my 8 to 5 days when I was a bookkeeper, I ran across this quote and I lost it. But it was a quote that said, true managers lift everybody else up. Because when you lift up those underneath you, they naturally lift you up. And I'm paraphrasing it, and it was a very succinct quote. And I remember that, and I thought, wow, that is healthy Capricorn, helping others succeed in the world of resources, helping others succeed in their social positions out in the world. Another one is, I like this one, and I kind of, you could put this down to all three earth elements, and I'm going to paraphrase this one, although I do have this one, and it used to hang in my old office when I was first starting out, when I left the 8 to 5 world and I became self-employed and I was first starting out. This was before my astrology days, though. It would be appreciated if those who are saying it cannot be done would stay out of the way of those who are doing it. I'll repeat it. It would be appreciated if those who are saying it cannot be done would stay out of the way of those who are doing it. I always thought that was another good little cliche. I'm a collector of cliches. And I kind of put that into that, that you can see the Scorpio in there. I'm a sun in Scorpio. But it also has that earth element in there. When we're in this physical environment, we just want to set the goals and go for it. And that's what Capricorn does in the physical world. Now, distortions of the element of Capricorn is wanting to be in control of all the resources and not sharing them. Or that famous quote, the end justifies the mean. Wanting to have our social position at all costs, wanting to have the resources at all costs, coming into what we see as the Pluto and Capricorn distortions of the haves and the have-nots, where the, upper 1% of the citizens in the United States control as much wealth as the bottom 80%. Those are extreme distortions of physical resources with Capricorn. And because of the distortions of patriarchal principles, which are excluding, taking, me versus you, that have been going on over the last 2,000 years, Piscean age, last 6,000 years, we've got some distortions of our physical resources going on all over the earth. And Pluto in Capricorn will have it, Pluto will expose it through its transit in Capricorn throughout the rest of this decade and the beginning of the next decade as Pluto moves through this 15-year transit in Capricorn. And so while Capricorn is still dealing with the accumulation of money and physical resources, including in this physical earth element, is controlling other people, controlling social positions, wanting to accumulate power as a physical earth element resource as well. Is this clear? Questions or comments on this element before I move into my last example? All right, so that works. Well, I had wanted to use this chart example, and I decided I would go out and research her chart and see what showed up. And as I was prepping, I was like, oh, I get it. This is Jennifer Lawrence, the hot young actress who is starring in the, what's those movies? The Hunger Games. I've not read the books, but I have went to the 2 movies. I have a young niece her age who just is enthralled by Jennifer Lawrence. And so born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, raised by 2 parents. Her mother was a children's camp manager. Her father is a construction worker. 2 older brothers. Oops, I forgot. First of all, here's 3 planets in Capricorn. Of course, look at the birth date, 1990. It was in 1993 that we had Uranus, Neptune make their 3 conjunctions. They have a 172-year cycle together. In 1993, Uranus and Neptune made their conjunctions at between 19 and 20 degrees Capricorn. So when you look at the kids who came in, I call them kids, along the early to mid 1990s, you will find Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn. In the early 90s, 1989, 1990, 91, we had Saturn in Capricorn as well. So Saturn is in its own sign. All 3 of these planets are retrograde. We don't see anything in the 10th house, but we do have 3 Capricorn planets, and we have the ruler of Capricorn in its own sign as well. You see that we have a grand trine in earth signs going on with Mercury in Virgo and Mars in Taurus to this Saturn Capricorn. And what other we've got? Looks like we've got the opposition to Chiron that might be going on here as well. So we'll work with that in a little bit, but that's pointing out to you some of the Capricorn Earth archetypes that we see in here. But back to a little bit with Jennifer Lawrence. She had decided at an early age of 14 that she wanted to become an actress. She was relentless with her parents, Capricorn, of I can do this, I can do this. And in order to get her parents' support, she graduated from high school 2 years early with a 3.9 GPA. I imagine the conversation went something like, okay, if I achieve this goal, will you then support me and let me go off and do it? And so that's what she did. And so she's pretty successful, 1990. So what is she? She's 24 years old. Her breakout film was Winter's Bone. I had not seen that. Where we really got to notice her was The Hunger Games. If you are not familiar, these are novels that were written by an author named Suzanne Collins, and it's a trilogy for young adults. And if you're not familiar with this, they've had the first book and the second book, and now the third book is, of course, what does Hollywood do? The third book is part 1 this November, part 2 next November. So it's not a trilogy of movies, there's 4 movies. Anyway, the premise of these movies is they're set in a futuristic time when we have the extremes of the haves and the have-nots. And so there's like, say, a dozen areas, if I remember correctly, where the masses are all gathered up and they are basically imprisoned in these compounds out in the country. They barely have enough food and clothing. It's just a very subsistence existence. And then we have these major cities where it's an extreme of opulence in regards to the clothing, the money, the lifestyle, the food. And once every year, there is a there are drawings, names taken out of a hat, where each of these 12 areas, let me just call them provinces, where each of these 12 poor provinces, they have names drawn out of a hat, and they draw one male and one female. And they are shipped off and trained, and they have to be young adults between, I think, 12 and 18 or something like that. They have to be young adults, and they're shipped off into this area, and they're fattened up, they're fed, and they're trained to fight. And once a year, they have what they call the Hunger Games. And basically, these 12 females and 12 males, they're given weapons, and they work with, it's set far enough into the future that resources materialize out of thin air, things that they're fighting against, all of a sudden adversaries like animated animals come out of the thin air to challenge them, but they fight to the death until there's just one person left alive. And I mean, that alone is just, you see all the Capricorn in this movie between the haves and the have-nots and forcing young adults to fight each other. Well, Jennifer Lawrence plays the female heroine, and when it comes down to her, it ends up coming down to that the male that was chosen from her province and her, it comes down to the two of them, and she refuses to fight him, he refuses to fight her, and they decide that they're going to commit suicide together and eat the poison fruit. And so the big old plutocrats, they stop it all, and they allow the both of them to live. And in the second movie, they become a romance. And in the second movie, they put together all of the, they change the rules, Capricorn. they decide that they're going to take all of the previous winners from all the years before, and they're going to create the Hunger Games of all Hunger Games and put them all in there together. Well, the masses are starting to rise up, and I think that's what the third and fourth movie from the third book is going to be based upon, which is going to be the masses just going for it. Leroy, I'm going to carry on, but I've got some lights shining out front, and I got two people walking up to the front door. Can't see who they are, and I think they're probably going to ring the doorbell. I don't know if these are our kids or not. So if you could come up, honey, I'd appreciate it, and I'll continue on with class. My office window sits so that I can see outside the front door to the house. So I thought, OMG, isn't this interesting that these Hunger Game movies that she's starring in that have brought her to such stardom in the world and resources, you know, one of the highest paying actresses in the world. She's the youngest actress to be nominated for 3 Academy Awards and won Silver Linings Playbook or something like that. Yeah, Silver Linings Playbook. That's where she won her Best Actress, Supporting Actress Award, or I don't remember. But anyway, isn't that interesting that these Hunger Games is such a Pluto and Capricorn story? And here she is, the example of that story. And so anyway, I think it's just this shining example of these 3 planets in Capricorn in the 11th house of all places. This is a Capricorn Aquarius story with the Hunger Games of the oppressed Capricorn going into the rebellion Aquarius. And here she is with these 3 planets, and that Saturn being new phased. She's known as an actress who is very honest, very forthcoming, very lovable, because she doesn't buy into all of the Hollywood trappings and speaks out about them a lot of the time. And she is probably one of the most sought after actresses that there is. If you've not seen Silver Linings Playbook, she was in that with Bradley Cooper. I did see that movie as well, and I very much enjoyed that movie. She played a new divorcee who she wasn't off her rockers, but she wasn't the smartest, you know, not the smartest marble in town. And she got involved with a gentleman who got out of an insane asylum. And it's a very sweet, endearing movie if you haven't seen it. She also did The American Hustle, if that's what it was. That one was very popular last year as well. Great performance in that one too. And so, you know, I've kind of thought, wow, this is a woman who's fairly young, quite successful quite early, and yet she is someone that I think I'm going to like watching as time goes by. I think she's going to be the next Meryl Streep. And so I wonder, I have to observe and correlate, but if you've observed Meryl Streep, who's turned her back on a lot of the Hollywood foo-fa, I think that Jennifer Lawrence is going to do the same, and I think there's a little bit more evolution than just consensus state going on here. Now, with this Venus, to sidetrack under the other Earth elements, with this Venus conjunct Jupiter and the South Node here with wide conjunctions here in the Earth houses, I'm going to be interested to see what this woman does with her resources. She used to help her mother in the children's camp with the children, so we may see some things come through with there. I don't know if she's been doing any philanthropy yet. Hold on, I didn't remember that. Let's see here. Oh, of course, she's already started her own foundation. She is active in charities such as World Food Program, Feeding America, the Thirst Project. She works with the Special Olympics, children with adults with disabilities, and she her own foundation, the Jennifer Lawrence Foundation, supports charities to help up and coming young actors be able to make it in the world of Hollywood. So there you go, right there. She's starting to come through and, in my world, put her money where her mouth is, Capricorn. And at this point, let me just see if I have any questions or comments from anybody else. It looks like it was our kids, Leroy. I'm going to close my office door. I'm back.
Yes, it was your kids, and all is clear. We had a previous question about, I think, the previous chart, but we're just going to let that go for now.
Okay. All right. I don't mind answering it if you want me to. I mean, I've got a little bit of time. Do you want me to quickly look at it?
Well, Pamela had some thoughts about Saturn and Virgo in the second in the last chart. We didn't have that, did we?
Saturn and Virgo in the second.
I didn't see that.
I don't have a Saturn and Virgo in the second.
Jupiter, yeah, okay. I was a little confused and trying to find, I was multitasking here as we went through the charts, but yeah, let's just move on.
Okay. So anyway, I was pleasantly surprised to see Jennifer Lawrence be such a more or less positive example of the Capricorn archetype. I see her, just continuing to have resources come to her in the acting world with this grand trine, with the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in the South Node. But I really see her being of service and helpful. We know that already through philanthropy that she's already started with children and world hunger and fresh water and helping up and coming young actors. And I also love this. When I saw this, I thought, OMG, here's my Hunger Games. Here is her personifying in her chart what she is acting out in the movies. She did not see herself as the feminine action hero that she's turning out to be in the Hunger Games. But all of the critics are saying nobody can imagine anybody but her doing that. To be able to have that Capricorn determination to just take on all of the powers that be and the plutocrats as that action figure in the movies, and to start the rebellion, to lead the masses into rising up. And Capricorn many times will deal with the masses on a very physical level, and Aquarius following will be that rebellion that will sometimes see Aquarius bring to Capricorn when it is too stuck in its controlling physical environment. So those are most of my comments, again, touching tidbits and recognizing our time. So one more time, any other comments or questions? And if not, I thank you all very, very much for showing up tonight, and I will see you for the Earth element, which will be, excuse me, one more slide on Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, hoping you've got an example now of how that Earth trine really operates as a temperament. And then again, December 3rd, we'll look at the element of air, and December 10th, we'll look at the element of water.
Thank you, Kim. Great job.
All right, thank you, everyone. And happy Thanksgiving to those of you in the U.S., and I hope